Craig, when we started this podcast way back when, summer of 2020, and we're 260 some odd episodes in. This one I wanted to do from the jump. If we had been brainstorming ideas, and I knew very little about Fort Mose at the time, other than just having kind of heard the name here and there. I was fortunate enough to visit Fort Mose, I want to say in the summer of 2023, one of the hottest days of the year. I will never forget how hot it was when my wife and I went to Fort Mose. It was before the fort structure was reconstructed in the spring of 2025, but they've got a wonderful museum there. It's only about 40 acres. It's just north of St. Augustine. If you're in St. Augustine for any amount of time, to bop up there, if you've got a car or take a ride share, it's well worth the time, because this is, and I don't think many people realize this is the first free settlement of Black people in what would become America.
Yeah, it's incredibly significant location, and I would say most people in Florida, much less most people in America, know nothing about it. And if they do know anything, they probably call it Fort Mose. So,
Yeah, there is, we think about maybe Savannah as a huge slave port, or Charleston, or Alexandria, Virginia, and those places all have an important role to play in sharing and retelling the history of slavery in America. But the history of freedom in America
yeah,
is just as important. And of course, those sites of the Underground Railroad. And just last week, Craig, with the Jonathan Dickinson episode, we were talking about, there's one of the most pernicious lies about the history of slavery in America was this foolhardy notion that the enslaved people accepted it. A lot of
yeah,
slave people liked I don't know, I guess the security, the comfort, whatever, and didn't really try all that often to break free of that bondage. That was ridiculous in every single instance. And here at Fort Mose is a great example of freedom seekers from the British colonies, from the Carolinas, risking obviously life and limb for a chance at freedom. They didn't become free the instant they stepped on Spanish colonial soil. It was more complicated than that, and we'll get into it in the episode. But this is a great example of how enslaved people always and in every instance attempt to secure their freedom, no matter the peril.
yeah.
And that is one of the stories at Fort Mose. If this kind of thing interests you, be sure to check out our Florida Black History YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, type in at Florida Black History. It will bring up all of our previous episodes related to Black history in Florida. This one will be up there shortly. And joining us today are Jane Landers, a historian, and Kathleen Deagan, an archaeologist. They are also both authors who collaborated on the book Fort Mose, Colonial America's Black Fortress of Freedom. And
I just finished it this morning, and it's well worth your time. It's a slim book. It's not very long. It's like a less than 200 pages, very profusely illustrated, and tells the story of the people of Fort Mose. It tells the story of the history of Fort Mose, and it joins it with the archaeology that underpins the whole story as well. And it's just, I find it absolutely fascinating.
yeah, it's a great. Fort Mose is a wonderful story of Florida history, American history, African American history. I mean, this one hits on a lot of targets. So let's get right to it. Jane Landers and Kathleen Deagan.
Thanks so much for joining us. This is such a fascinating topic, and one that I think more people ought to know about. Let me start off by asking the dumb question, which is, why is it Fort Mose and not Fort Mose?
Well, it's Spanish pronunciation, I guess it got anglicized into Mose, but they have it spelled every which way in different maps and English documents and Spanish documents.
Well, I was giving a talk once about the archaeology at Mose, and a very distinguished Spanish colonial historian jumped up and I was saying Fort Mose, and he shouted out from the audience, "No, it's Mose. It should be Mose." So
Oh
I've
my.
gone with that. That was Louis Serrano.
But I've also seen West African maps, and I've always been fascinated by a little bit of the interior in sort of this West African Senegambian area, an African group called the Mossi, Mossi. And Kathy, I never checked it out further, but I wondered about that.
Well, I've also often wondered if it wasn't a Native American word.
And I think somebody told me it was at one point, but
Yeah,
I didn't know if that was anecdote or if they had documents. But say, I remember when we started all of this, that some lady, remember Kathy, got in touch with you and thought it was because Moses,
yeah,
it was about Moses and the people.
yeah, Moses. And
So where was Fort Mose?
Kathy, you want to give the directions?
it's actually about a mile and a half, almost 2 miles maybe, from north of the Castillo de San Marcos on a marsh creek that connects into the intercoastal waterway.
And why was it put there? Why was it not closer to St. Augustine?
Well, I mean, Jane will tell you, and she's done the work on this, that it was really a first line of defense against the British, who were threatening Spain at that time by settling in Savannah and Charleston. And but also there was at that same area a Spanish mission there that was wiped out by disease, by plague, in just 2 years or even a year before Mose was occupied. So they probably took advantage of some of the infrastructure that was already there. Jane, you may have other thoughts about that.
No, same thing. I always say, because, who would be the most fierce opponents to the English advance except those that they escaped,
Right.
slavery from.
And tell us about the folks who were in Fort Mose. How did they
Jane?
get there?
Well, it had been a long process of people starting to escape from the English colony that was established in Charlestown in 1670, which was supposed to be, at least Spain considered it their territory. 1687, I find the first that I can track runaways that are heading south to St. Augustine in a little canoe, men, women, and a nursing baby. And enough of them show up that the Spanish governor says to the king, writes to the king, what am I supposed to do with these people? And that's when they established a new royal order that I called religious sanctuary for anybody fleeing a Protestant area and coming into the Spanish Catholic world would be able to claim freedom if they converted to Catholicism and defended the community and all the rest that everybody was supposed to do.
And so it was sort of the Underground Railroad before there was an Underground Railroad, but people started
Right.
fleeing to the St. Augustine area. How many folks wound up there, and how did they wind up in Fort Mose?
Well, I don't know that we always have a specific number, but Kathy, do you remember what we had on that census when we finally get a census?
I think there were 87
Okay,
people
you're
at that
you're
point,
better at memory.
but I'm sure it fluctuated as people came and went.
We finally get a census in 1752. A priest made a real census of the place, household by household by household, and tells you, who exactly is in it, an estimate of their age, and that sort of thing. But that's the first official census I ever saw.
Well, it's the first one anyone saw. Really, that
Okay.
was not known. We didn't know anything about the actual people until Jane found that census, and it's a real insight to me, to the town, because it lists often where in Africa all of these people came from, which
Yeah.
is
Wow.
fascinating.
Where
That
was
to me
that?
is the most important part of it, actually, that it dehomogenizes, if that's a word, the African population there, and that they were so distinct. And also that comes out of those baptismal records that we have. The Catholic Church records will also record ethnonyms, they call it, which tell you how they identified as either, from Congo or Calabar or Mandingos,
Ibos, Harar.
Igbos, yeah.
What are the present day countries in Africa where these Fort Mose inhabitants were from?
Well, Senegal, Gambia, Ghana, Angola, that I know.
Yeah, yeah, and those were huge ports in the transatlantic slave trade, going way back all the way until its conclusion. Help people understand, because at this period, Florida's Spanish. It's not English. The English and the Spanish have different perspectives towards the enslavement of human beings. How did English plantation slavery in the Low Country in South Carolina work versus how Black people might be able to live with a greater sense of freedom once they crossed into Florida, Spanish colonial Florida?
Here, this is my usual thing in classes to talk about the two big institutions that make the difference are law and religion. And so the law is Roman law, which considered slavery an accident, basically, of fate. You could be imprisoned or made enslaved for crimes, for debt, for anything practically, and selling yourself into slavery was an option. But you could also come out of it in many different ways, and everybody could be an enslaved person, even a Spaniard. So it wasn't race-based and it wasn't perpetual. And that was the legal basis. And then the Catholic Church also wanted to include everybody, indigenous Africans, anybody else they could convert. So both of those institutions are quite different than the chattel slavery that the English established, which considered everybody a piece of property with no humanity, no families, no access to religion or law.
And so people would in desperation escape those English colonial areas and come to Florida and convert to Catholicism so they could be free, right?
Right.
Correct.
And what would they do upon arriving in Fort Mose? How'd they earn a living, I guess, to support themselves? Because they're not going to have any property or title or wealth. They have the opportunity to be free, but they are starting from dead level scratch.
Kathy, you want to answer that from the
Well-
archaeological point of view?
Well, I'll be saying what you found out in the documents. Ben, you can add to this, but we learned that they farmed, they fished, they hunted, they worked as scouts and interpreters for the Spanish, and they also were, I'm sure, put to work on the fortification and improvement and building houses at Mose, but they were also partly subsidized by the Spanish government. And so they weren't totally on their own out there in a sense. And they were part of the militia. They were a militia force with a white officer.
And the only thing I might add would be that they also became cattlemen and would round up cattle that had gone off into the wild, and which is something Peter Wood, our friend who also worked on the exhibit, also talked about in Carolina, that African slaves there would also be the cattle rounders and or herdsmen, and it gave them knowledge of the landscape and the environment and contact with indigenous people and so on.
So Fort Mose is a little over a mile from Castillo de San Marcos and what we think of today as like downtown touristy St. Augustine. That's where the fort is. Did the freedom seekers live down towards the Castillo de San Marcos and St. Augustine, or were there houses north, so to speak, or right around Fort Mose?
What we know, I think, is that they had small houses outside, and not so small, some of them, because in that, and Kathy, correct me if I'm getting off timing here, but when the English come in 1740, General Oglethorpe talks about, seeing some of the well-to-do, not well-to-do, but I mean, effective housing with fires still going in them and so on, and that they did not burn them or destroy them because they could serve as hospitals for the Englishmen. So they had houses out there outside the little walled fortress area.
And they weren't necessarily what we think of as houses, right? They were round and had thatched roofs. Am I remembering correctly?
Well, that may have been, Kathy was at the earlier groups, because Oglethorpe's writing about carpentry and all of that they were sawed boards, houses with fireplaces and the food.
Some were. I'm still uncertain about whether that was right at Mose or on the way when they were marching. But in any case, they did have what we would think of probably as European style houses, but there were others that were thatched houses like those of the Indians, particularly in the second Fort Mose, where we did find archaeologically a circular a house about 12 feet in diameter that was probably one of the homes.
Yeah, I think that description of Oglethorpe's is the first attacked area, and it was, I mean, they had fled so recently that the food was
Yeah.
still cooking on the fireplace, you know.
When is the first Fort Mose built? When do enough of these freedom seekers come to the area where the Spanish and the freedom seekers decide, we should have like our own thing here? This is a movement and not just like a couple of people.
Well, 1738 is, when there's enough people that the governor establishes, the right to give them a town. It's sort of like on the model of an Indian mission town. If there are enough of them, you put a settlement, give them land, give them, as Kathy said, some supplies to get them going, post a priest there to make sure they're learning the catechism and all of that. The governor is expecting a global war, and it does come in 1740, but he knew that all around the Caribbean, Spaniards were under assault by the English. And so he expected that the English just north of them would also attack them.
What led to the loss of the first Mose and then getting a second one?
Well, Kathy, do you want to, or?
Well, Jane's the historian on the project. I'm the archaeologist. So
Okay, well,
when there are history issues, I'll defer to Jane.
It's the assault by General Oglethorpe, and he has talked the Carolinians and the Georgians that he's supposed to govern into putting together a joint assault on Mose, and it includes indigenous people who were allying with the English for their trade goods and so on, and it included even some enslaved people, and they come down in 1740 to attack from land, and up from Jamaica comes a naval fleet also to bombard St. Augustine for about a month. One of the priests writes that they're all inside the walls of the Castillo now undergoing this naval assault, and praying every day and so on, while out on the frontier, eventually there'll be this big battle of Bloody Mose.
What took place at the Battle of Bloody Mose, which is kind of recounted at the fort for people who visit every year, there is a reenactment of that event.
Well, it turns out like in the middle of the night, early morning, the Spaniards group and go back out to Mose, which has been occupied by the English, and they're asleep at the wheel. And there's a big battle in which the captain of Mose participates and claims, a pretty important role in that battle. And the governor also supports him in that, claim. So it took place as they go and try to drive the English back out.
And I think one of the things that the reenactment, it doesn't come out and say, but implies, is that there were atrocities and a lot of brutality involved in that battle. And so I think the soldiers there got a reputation for being very, very aggressive, very ferocious.
Roughly how many combatants were there on either side?
Oh boy, I'm not good at numbers. Kathy, do you remember?
Well, there weren't that, I don't think of them always as combatants, because the English got routed pretty quickly.
Oh yeah.
And there was a regiment of Spanish Africans, black soldiers, and some native soldiers and Spanish soldiers. I don't know, probably 40 or 50, I would guess. And but as Jane said, the English were asleep at the wheel, and they were surprised. And most of them escaped only with their clothes.
Wow.
Not even all of them.
And then after that, you see the Carolinians pointing fingers at Oglethorpe and vice versa to place the blame for the loss that they never expected, from that outpost of Africans.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're go all the way back to Savannah then, and where they had come from, essentially, to leave Fort Mose, alone for a period?
Yeah, they have to go north and then explain themselves for all the losses, I guess. And but they don't stop trying to raid the area. There was no Mose after that, at least not the first one, but the English and the Indians that they sort of conscript to go with them keep raiding the northern frontiers.
Now, what do you
When
mean when you said there was no Fort Mose after that? What happened to it?
Well, although people move into town for a period, when after that devastation, the second fort will be rebuilt in 1752. Will last until the English finally acquire Florida, not by conquest, but by international treaty.
Say that the fort itself was a pretty small structure, and it was largely, the defenses were largely earth and mud. And the English themselves breached some of the walls, the earthen walls around, and the moat, and destroyed some. And I think the Spaniards, in the process of routing the English, destroyed the rest of it.
And that's a good point, and we should probably make a clarification there. People are thinking of the Castillo de San Marcos, which still stands, and it's this large coquina. Fort Mose is nothing like that.
No.
Tell us about the original Fort Mose and what the site looked like. This is not like a medieval castle in Scotland or something. So help people visualize what this was, the original.
Well, it was about 50 feet to a side, a square, and it had an earth wall around it with bastions at the corners for guns, and a moat that was probably about maybe 12 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and it was planted with prickly pear cactus and Spanish bayonets.
That's
Inside,
my
it was
favorite
really
detail. That's my
Yeah.
favorite detail, that they used plants as part of their defenses.
Oh,
Yeah,
and
they were.
anyone who's run across a Spanish bayonet plant understands where the name comes from.
Well, in
A
fact,
gorgeous,
one of
gorgeous plant, but woo-wee,
yeah,
steer
one of
clear.
the escaping British guys recounted that, he had been stuck by those thorns, and all he had left was his underwear, and it was really kind of horrible incident. But inside that earthen walled area was just a simple squared kind of a vertical, we think, tower. No one ever really described the fort. And Jane and I had kind of the unenviable job over the last year and a half of working with the Park Service to help develop. They wanted to restore a reconstruction of it, but no one really knows what it looked like. So we had to work with analogies and other forts of the same time period and the very few descriptions. So what it appears, what we believe, is that it was kind of just a square tower inside that wall, almost medieval, as you said. It's just a keep and a moat.
And they would only post a small number of men out there in that second period. They would go out, and be there for a night and come back in or something like that. They had a rotating system of a small number of actual soldiers posted out there.
But they did live in the air. There was the
Yeah.
villages nearby.
Oh, yeah, they lived
Yeah.
nearby,
Yeah.
but I mean, to actually be in that fort and be watching, there weren't that many people in there, so it's
And for the freedom seekers from the English chattel slavery and those colonies, was this a formalized network? Was there like a Harriet Tubman figure who went back and forth? Was this something that was well known, or was it more ad hoc with people just sort of figuring it out on their own and coming down there in the ones and twos, kind of I don't want to say haphazardly, but without kind of any sort of greater organization?
Well, the Spanish actually made an effort to publicize that policy of the religious sanctuary. And there was a Scottish trader that I've been looking at who goes back and forth between Carolina or Charleston and St. Augustine, selling to both sides of the competition. And some of his slaves ran away while the boat was in St. Augustine. And later he comes back and says they laughed at him, and knew they didn't have to go back. But the governor, in many, it's a standard thing that when there's a royal decree, it's announced in all the plazas all over the Spanish Empire, and they're supposed to, post it on the door of the church or whatever and make it known. So, and one of the English accounts complains about, this announcement that was going around that everybody seemed to know about.
Wow. So people knew, hey, if I can make it to St. Augustine, I can be free.
Right.
That's great. Tell us, you had mentioned briefly about cattle. Tell us about, I'm not sure I'm getting this name right, Diego de Espinosa.
Oh,
Okay. Well, he's
continue.
listed as one of the most important cattle ranchers in Spanish Florida, and he's of mixed African and Spanish descent. He owns slaves himself. His plantation ends up being fortified and called Fort Diego, and he is an interesting character that somebody should do more research on.
So he became a wealthy cattle rancher in the
Yeah.
St. Augustine area?
Which was again is not uncommon on all the frontiers. Spain's had a small population and it's spread around the world. So people of African and indigenous descent have more options and more possibilities to rise socially and economically than they did in a plantation system, which was, more like the English and heavily occupied.
That second period of the fort, 1752 onward, did the flow of freedom seekers continue at about the same pace as before? Was it largely steady, or were there ebbs and flows to that?
Tell you the
Well,
truth, I think it's a lot less because the English and the indigenous are still raiding the frontier all the time. And then all the governors are always talking about how impoverished the area is. And I haven't really tracked big groups coming in during that time period, but I could be missing them.
I think you're right. Probably not groups. Although Susan Parker had a paper recently that was really interesting. That white indentured servants on many of these plantations kind of followed that same path to Florida. They
Wow.
didn't live at Fort Mose, but she's documented a number of these people who escaped and came to Florida and settled in the town.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
had one family and they're Irish Catholics, is the point.
Yeah.
And they traveled with some Africans. I had that in the Black Society book, and now I can't remember the name of the family, but they have to represent why they came and ask for sanctuary and all that too, just like, and the basis is their Catholicism.
Interesting. You said diplomacy, the English wound up owning that area. So what
Mhm.
happened to the folks from Fort Mose then? Did they leave? Did they stick around?
Well, they're offered the opportunity to stay, and supposedly their rights would be respected, but they knew better. And so indigenous and Africans in great numbers left with the Spaniards to go to Cuba. And there were a series of ships, and there are records that show you exactly who was on what ship and all of that. And they're given eventually, like a year later, given land in the west of Havana in the province of Matanzas, where they establish a town called St. Augustine of the New Florida.
Wow. Does that
And
town still exist?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and that's what it's called, St. Augustine of the New Florida? That really?
Well, they actually call it ceiba mocha now. It just means a chopped down ceiba tree, which is not lucky. That's supposed to be very unlucky, actually.
But people
Um,
there in the town know that it was San Agustin de la Nueva Florida, and in fact, the parish registers were still up in there was kind of a ruined church there, and they were up in the attic area. That I don't know, Jane, if they went back all the way to the Mosaic people, but I think some of them did. That
I
Bruce,
think so. And
Bruce
you and our wonderful old Professor Mike Gannon and Bruce Chappell, the librarian, found those. Didn't you rescue those?
we did find them just out of sheer blind luck because of course we wanted to go to Ceiba Mocha and the new St. Augustine of the New Florida, and they just happened to be there.
so
But the
one of the
listeners might want to know that we have all of those Catholic Church records dating back to the 16th century digitized, and we have them up online on a project I started a long time ago called, when I was still a graduate student of Kathy's, called slavesocieties.org.
Now, one of the things I really love about your book is that you tie in the history and recount the history, and then you tell about the archaeology that supports it. How did you first wind up doing excavations at Fort Mose?
Well, I'll field that one, Jean.
Please.
I first started at went to Fort Mose actually in 1971
Oh,
with
I
my
didn't know that.
professor, Charles Fairbanks, who was one of the very first archaeologists in the country to study Black American history. He worked on plantation sites, but he really wanted to look at a place where there were free blacks living in the colonial period, and he knew about Fort Mose. Some people did, historians did, but pretty much nobody else, it seemed. But he took groups of students, and we tried to locate, doing shovel tests and borings, where the site might have been. Well, even though we had a really good idea of where Fort Mose was based on the early probings in the 1970s, we just couldn't get funding to go back and really look at that site and determine if it really was or wasn't. It wasn't until 1984, that a group of legislators were in St. Augustine on a trolley tour train and learning about archaeology and history. And one legislator, Representative Bill Clark from Lauderdale Lakes, actually, when he heard about Fort Mose, he decided this is really important. We need to know about this and do something about it. And so he got a bill passed through the legislature that would support investigations at Fort Mose and trying to bring it more into the public eye. And that's when we began our more long-term work there. And one of the first things the grant let us do was have Jane look through documents in Spain and try and find anything she could about the people and about Fort Mose. No one had really done that, and it was very successful. And based on that work, we began our actual excavations at the site.
And you didn't find big stuff, but what you found were very significant things, I thought, like the St. Christopher's medal.
Well, right. We did find really fragmentary items, but the more important thing I think we found was evidence of the fort. We found segments of the moat and segments of the earthen wall that had been around it, and it was cased with mud. And it was at that point, it was really important to establish that it was Fort Mose, because there was a certain resistance to the idea that such a thing even existed in the town. I mean, people, the Augustine, and in the 80s, it had only been really a decade or 15 years since the riots with Martin Luther King and a lot of really terrible race-based violence in the community. And it was still a very small town, nothing like it is today. So we really had to demonstrate that this was, in fact, a fort, and it was Fort Mose, using Jane's information. And so once we established that it was, we were able to recover some information about the daily life and what was happening in the fort, but not as much as we would have liked to, for a couple of reasons. One is that in the negotiations between the landowner and the legislature on the site itself, he wanted to sell it. The legislature wanted Florida to have that site in the public domain, but of course they couldn't agree on the price. So eventually the site was taken by eminent domain and was put into the public lands. But during all of that, the landowner decided we were no longer welcome to work there. It was still private property. So we left at that point before we were able to finish what we had wanted to do. And the second reason is that Henry, the developer who made such a change in St. Augustine, dredged out all around that area. Hundreds of thousands of meters of soil were taken from around the Fort Mose area. Probably, I'm sure Jane, I don't know if Jane thinks this or not, but probably a lot of the farms and people were living in that area.
Yeah.
And that soil is today under what's now Flagler College. And it filled in Cordova Street which is a main thoroughfare in St. Augustine. So between that and the political climate of the time, I've always said, though, that the best thing about the archaeology at Fort Mose was the history. It's one of the rare times when the archaeology provokes history to be done. Usually it's the other way around. And that really brought Fort Mose to the attention of people. And I know Jane shares this too, that it's really, we really feel proud of the part we had in that. Today, it really is something that the Black community owns, and kind of they run it. The Fort Mose Historical Society is a support organization for the Park Service, but they are deeply invested. And that was the first organization I've ever known in St. Augustine that had white and Black community members working for the same thing, the same history, which is remarkable. But the archaeology was fascinating, but I think the history was much more important.
Has the reconstruction of the fort been completed? When I visited, that was a plan, but it had not been done. Although this was, you know, maybe like 2023 now. Is what you talked about, the singular sort of column fort, been completed?
It's completed and there, and you can visit it. Jane and I were at the grand opening a few months ago.
Oh, fantastic. How does that help the interpretation, or you know, what takes place there when people go and visit?
Well, one of the reasons that the society and the Park Service were so keen on having I call it a representation of the fort. It is this, to scale, it's life size. It's visited by a lot of school groups. And the first thing the children would all want to know is, well, where's the fort? We're visiting Fort Mose. Where is it? And they got probably a little bored without the fort there, although there's a very nice site museum. I think for the Black community, it was really important to have that representation so that there could be a really visible, tangible reflection of that whole story.
One thing that I thought was also, rewarding was that when the Park Service applied for a challenge grant to make this possible, the local businesses contribute more than we needed for the match, including the Jacksonville Jaguars and different banks in the area. It was really an indication that they were all being very supportive of this effort. And so that was nice. And then, Kathy got it on, what was it, National Historic Landmark? Was that the first one to market? And then it was placed on the National Park Service Underground Railroad site, and then we got it on the UNESCO Route of the Enslaved People site. So it can never be now developed into condos or whatever else. Supposedly these designations will save it from
No pickleball
development.
courts at Fort Mose.
Yeah.
and no golf courses.
Yeah.
When do you think it started picking up? You know, you were doing this work back decades ago, and then it becomes a national landmark in the 90s. But I still wonder how many people know that this incredibly important site to American history, when you think about the first free settlement of Black people in what is now America. I mean, that is front page news. That's history equal to any site in America. Bunker Hill, Plymouth Rock, I mean, Gettysburg, you name it. And I hear more and more about Fort Mose. How has that process, beyond the archaeology, beyond the history, I guess now we're talking about marketing, how has that effort to raise awareness of the significance of this site evolved over, the past maybe even just 5 years?
It's been always frustrating to me as an historian that the narrative for African American history picks up in 1619, when so-called 20 and odd Negroes were unloaded barefoot and bound in, Virginia. Well, half of the country from Florida to California was under Spanish rule and had a whole different system with many of these kinds of communities you could examine if you would. So it's been really kind of hard to change that narrative. And because there's been so many wonderful projects done on, the English plantation slave systems, but less on our side. And so it's rewarding to see some attention at least.
I've been equally frustrated with from an archaeological perspective and a museum perspective. And what you mentioned, Chad, the question you asked about why isn't this better known in given the importance of the site? And we wondered the same thing. And I think there have been a lot of efforts. I know Jane and I and a number of other people participated for years in the Florida Humanities Council teacher seminars every year. And we would get over the course of several weeks, maybe 200 teachers from around the country to participate in learning not just about Fort Mose, but about St. Augustine and the Spanish period. But one segment of that was always Fort Mose, and the teachers were fascinated and always said, we're going to take this back and spread the word. And somehow it never really resonated. I've never fully understood that. I don't
Well,
think
it's probably part and parcel with, how much older St. Augustine is than, say, Jamestown or, the
There's
first Thanksgiving or, all of these
rivalry,
other, this foolishness about firsts on the American continent. I mean, all of our white settler colonial European descended American history really comes from an English lean as opposed to a Spanish lean. And for every instance of Fort Mose being overlooked, we could say, well, yeah, but St. Augustine was before that. And yeah, but St. Augustine, and this is still America, is it not? It was not one of the 13 original colonies, but all of that Spanish colonial Florida history is really overshadowed by British, English pieces of it.
and by American history. I think American history, until fairly recently, has rarely included that story. Jane had some worked with some textbook publishers to try and get that Mose story and the whole Spanish colonial period in there, but it has, until recently, it has really not caught the popular imagination. I think it has now. I think at least, Jane, I don't know about you, but I first started seeing more people involved in asking questions and pieces in the media after the museum was built, and there was an actual building that kind of told that story. Although it wasn't widespread, and we've been hammering away at this for 40 years.
Yeah. And I guess on a parallel track, and Craig and I have talked about this a lot on the podcast as well, Florida's civil rights history has been totally overshadowed consciously and unconsciously. And like you mentioned, there were a lot of people in St. Augustine, much the same as when MLK was there and what took place during the civil rights movement, that did not want this history associated with St. Augustine and Spanish colonial and tourism and Sunshine State and Welcome to Florida and the whole infrastructure of family tourist trips to the Sunshine State.
As Kathy mentioned, we always produced educational materials for those fourth grade teachers because state history is taught at fourth grade level. We always did that. I worked with McMillan McGraw-Hill. There was a fourth grade textbook adopted that included that and all the indigenous archaeology too. We tried, and then it seems like sometimes there's flashback against that maybe.
That's a good point. Well, thanks so much for being with us today. This has been a fascinating topic, and I'm hopeful that people will listen to this and say, I didn't know, but now I know. And they'll tell other people about it.
Fort Mose is a historic state park. It is right there next to St. Augustine. You can go. It's open year round. The reenactment of the Bloody Mose battle is late June every year. And with the reconstructed fort now is the best time to visit. Jane Landers, historian, Kathleen Deagan, archaeologist. The book Fort Mose, Colonial America's Black Fortress of Freedom. Thank you so much for the work you've done over those long many years to bring this history back to the forefront, and for joining us, of course, on this episode.
Thank
you
you
for doing this.
A lot of great stuff there, Craig. Of course,
yes.
Our episode on Kingsley Plantation ties into this and that whole difference between Spanish system of enslavement, English chattel slavery. Of course, our MLK and St. Augustine episode,
Oh,
one of
yeah.
my favorites. We did do a whole episode on the Castillo de San Marcos. We did an episode on the Timucuan Indians of this area. So there's a lot, a number of episodes on St. Augustine of all stripes and varieties. So a lot in the archive to go through here. And, I mean it when I say, when you think about, put the bold text in a headline: first Black free settlement in America.
Yeah.
That is some major league history that, as we mentioned, until recently was lost, and it is still not celebrated, I think, to the extent that it could be.
Yeah, yeah, and I should mention, by the way, their book is not an academic book. It's not a textbook type of book. It's it's a very easy read. You could probably give it to your middle schoolers to read. As an adult, I really appreciated how very plain spoken it was about what they were dealing with, what they found, and it bounces between history and archaeology to sort of build up the whole story of Fort Mose, and it puts it into this historic context of the times too. And I recommend everybody in Florida ought to read it, quite frankly. Everybody.
There's a link in the show notes. Do it. Welcome to Florida.
Welcome to Florida.